If you follow my channel, Forgotten Coordinates, you know that I don't scare easily. I've slept in abandoned asylums in Ohio and trekked through radioactive zones in Eastern Europe. My cameraman, Dave, and I have seen it all. But what happened last November in the deep woods of the Pacific Northwest wasn't just creepy, it was wrong. It was a glitch in reality that I still can't explain. We were looking for a decommissioned logging camp, but the GPS had been acting up for an hour, spinning in circles on the dashboard screen. We were deep off-road, navigating a muddy trail that looked like it hadn't seen a tire in 20 years. That's when we saw it. A rusted, bullet-riddled metal sign half swallowed by an oak tree. It barely read, Esther's Hollow, 2 miles. I checked my phone, no service. I checked the offline maps, nothing. According to the satellite data, we were driving through dense forest. There was no town here. Naturally, for a channel dedicated to lost places, this was gold. We decided to follow the arrow. The first thing that hit us when we broke through the tree line was the silence. Usually, abandoned places are noisy, old wood creaking, wind howling through broken windows, birds singing, crickets chirping, but Esther's Hollow was silent. It was a vacuum. No birds, no wind, just a heavy, suffocating stillness that made your ears ring. The town was small, maybe 20 buildings clustered around a main street that had long since turned to gravel and weeds. It looked like a mining town from the turn of the century that had been left to rot. There was a wooden church at the end of the road, its steeple snapped and leaning at a sick 45-degree angle, pointing at the ground like a finger accusing the earth of something terrible. Dave started filming. We walked past a general store with shattered windows. The shelves inside were empty, stripped bare by decades of looters or decay. The air smelled of wet rot and stagnant water. It was the standard ghost town vibe until we reached the end of the row. That's when the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. Surrounded by collapsing shacks and piles of rubble, sat a single white cottage. It wasn't gray or weathered. The paint was fresh, bright white. The windows weren't broken, they were gleaming. There were flower boxes with dead brown plants in them, but the boxes themselves were newly painted. "Are you seeing this?" Dave whispered, pointing the camera at the house. "Squatters?" "Maybe," I said, though I didn't believe it. "Squatters don't paint the siding." We approached the porch. It didn't creak. The contrast between this perfect house and the rotting church looming behind it was nauseating. I reached for the doorknob. It was unlocked. I pushed the door open, expecting the smell of meth, trash, or animal feces, the usual smells of the abandoned. Instead, I was hit with a wave of warmth and the smell of rosemary and roasted meat. We walked into the living room. It was spotless. There was no dust. A grandfather clock ticked rhythmically against the wall, the only sound in the entire town. We moved into the kitchen and my blood ran cold. On the dining table, a place was set for 4. Porcelain plates, polished silverware, and napkins folded into swans. In the center of the table was a pot roast steaming hot. It hadn't just been cooked, it had been pulled out of the oven minutes ago. "Is someone here?" I called. My voice cracked. Silence. I walked over to the stove burner. The blue flame of the gas burner was on. A kettle was sitting on it, trembling slightly as the water inside reached a boil. "Dave," I said, grabbing his arm, "we need to go, now." "Wait," said Dave, zooming in on the food. "There's no car outside. There are no tire tracks in the mud except ours. Who cooked this?" I reached out to turn off the stove burner. It felt like the polite thing to do before running for our lives. But as soon as the flame died and the whistling of the kettle faded, a new sound emerged. It was coming from beneath us. The sound was low at first, a vibration that rattled the silverware on the table. Thump, thump, thump. It was rhythmic. It sounded like a heartbeat, but heavy, like someone hitting a drum covered in wet leather. And then came the voices. It wasn't speech, and it wasn't singing. It was a guttural, droning chant, a single note held by a dozen voices, bending upwards and then snapping back down. Ah-hum, ah-hum. Dave looked at me, his face pale. Is that coming from the basement? We should have run. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to bolt out the front door and never look back. But curiosity is a disease, and we had it bad. Plus, the camera was rolling. We followed the sound to a pantry door in the kitchen. The chanting was louder now, more frantic. I opened the door. There were no stairs, just a rug. I kicked the rug aside, revealing a heavy wooden trap door with a rusted iron ring. The chanting was right below us now. It sounded wet, like the throats making the noise were filled with fluid. I signaled Dave to kill the light on his camera. We needed to see without being seen. I slowly, agonizingly slowly, lifted the trap door an inch. A beam of flickering orange light cut through the gap. The smell of sulfur and old copper, like dried blood, wafted up, overpowering the smell of the roast beef. I peered through the crack. The basement was massive, far larger than the footprint of the house should allow. It looked like it connected to the old mine tunnels. The walls were dirt, reinforced with ancient timber. In the center of the room, lit by dozens of candles, was a circle of figures. There were about 10 of them. They wore beige robes made of coarse burlap that covered them from neck to toe. But it was their faces that made me nearly drop the trap door. They had painted their skin with thick white industrial paint. It was caked on, cracking around their eyes. And over their mouths, where their lips should be, they had painted a thick black X. They were swaying in unison. In the center of their circle, tied to a wooden chair, was a man. He was unconscious, his head lolling to the side. He was wearing a North Face jacket and jeans. He looked like a hiker. The chanting stopped abruptly. The silence that followed was heavier than before. One of the figures in the robes turned. It didn't turn its body. Its neck just seemed to snap toward the ceiling, looking directly at the crack where I was peeking. The white paint around its eyes crinkled. It saw me. "Run!" I screamed. I let the trap door slam shut. A split second later, a horrific, inhuman shriek erupted from beneath the floor, like a mountain lion screaming in a tunnel. We heard the wooden stairs below groan under the weight of a stampede. Dave and I scrambled over the pristine dining table, sending the pot roast and china crashing to the floor. We burst out of the house and sprinted across the overgrown yard. "Keys! Keys!" Dave yelled. We threw ourselves into the Jeep. I jammed the key into the ignition. Behind us, the front door of the white cottage exploded outward. The figures poured onto the porch, moving with jerky, unnatural speed, their beige robes flapping in the windless air. The engine sputtered. "Come on, come on!" I slammed the steering wheel. The figures were off the porch now, sprinting on all fours like animals toward the car. I turned the key again. The engine roared to life. I threw it into reverse, tires spinning in the mud, slinging dirt into the faces of the things chasing us. We tore down the trail, bouncing violently over rocks and roots. I didn't let off the gas until we hit the paved highway 10 miles away. We drove straight to the state police station in the next county. We showed them the footage, the town, the house, the trap door. We didn't get the cultists on film, but the audio of that chanting was enough to make the desk sergeant call in the SWAT team. They went out to the coordinates the next morning. Here is the part that keeps me up at night. They found the town, they found the church, they found the White House, but inside it was empty. The furniture was gone, the food was gone. The dust was thick on the floor, undisturbed for years. However, they did find the basement, and in the corner of that dirt room, huddled and terrified, they found the hiker. He had been reported missing 3 weeks prior from a trail 40 miles away. He was dehydrated and couldn't speak, but he was alive. The police never found the people in the beige robes. There were no tracks leading out of the town. It was as if they had simply evaporated into the walls. But sometimes when I review the footage from that day, specifically the audio from the moment we entered the house, I can hear something we missed at the time. Before the chanting started, underneath the sound of the boiling water, there's a faint, whispery voice that says, "Set another plate. They are here." If you live in Washington State, you know not to mess with the mountain passes in winter. I know that rule. I've driven Stevens Pass in Snoqualmie since I was 16. But 3 years ago, I got cocky, and it almost cost me my life in a way that had nothing to do with the cold. It was late December. I was trying to beat a storm front moving in from the coast to get home for New Year's. My GPS suggested a scenic shortcut through a secondary logging road that would shave off 30 minutes. I took it. 20 minutes later, the sky turned a bruised purple, and the snow started falling, not in flakes, but in sheets. Within an hour, I was driving in a white void. My headlights just reflected off the wall of snow, blinding me. I was crawling at 5 miles an hour when the car fishtailed. I corrected, but the wheels hit a patch of black ice. I slid sideways, the sickening crunch of metal echoing as my front end slammed into a snowbank. The engine sputtered and died. I tried to restart it. Nothing. The temperature was dropping fast, and I had no cell service. I was preparing to freeze to death when I saw a faint orange glow through the swirling white. I grabbed my go bag and trudged toward the light. It was a cabin set back from the road, almost invisible against the tree line. Nailed to a pine tree was a piece of plywood with hand-painted letters in dripping red paint. Rooms. Heat. It looked sketchy, but the alternative was hypothermia. I hammered on the heavy oak door. It opened a few moments later. The man standing there was massive, easily 6'5", wearing a flannel shirt stained with grease and dark fluid. He had a thick, unkempt beard and eyes that seemed to look through me rather than at me. "Car trouble?" His voice was like gravel grinding together. "Yeah, slid off the road. Can I pay for a night?" He stepped aside. "Cash, no cards. Name's Eli." The inside of the cabin was suffocatingly hot. A cast-iron wood stove in the center of the room was roaring. The air smelled strange, a mix of wet dog, sawdust, and something metallic like old pennies. "I'm Mark," I said, dropping my bag on a bench. Before I could unzip my jacket, Eli was there. He moved with unsettling speed for a big man. He grabbed my bag. "Hey," I protested. "Wet," he grunted. "Need to dry it by the fire." He didn't ask, he just took it. He placed it on a high shelf above the stove, well out of my reach. Then he turned and pointed a thick, dirty finger at a door in the corner of the room. It was reinforced with 3 heavy iron deadbolts, which seemed excessive for a pantry. "That's the basement," Eli said. His tone dropped an octave. "Don't go near it. Stairs are rotten. You step on them, you break your neck. Understand?" "Understood," I nodded. He stared at me for a long, uncomfortable 5 seconds, then pointed to a sagging couch. "Sleep there." The evening dragged on. Eli didn't speak. He sat in a rocking chair facing the basement door, whittling a piece of wood with a hunting knife. The wind howled outside, shaking the cabin walls. But around 10 p.m., the wind died down, and the silence of the snow took over. That's when I heard it. It came from behind the reinforced door. Scritch, scritch, thud. I froze. It sounded like something large dragging its claws against wood. Eli stopped whittling. He didn't look surprised. He looked attentive. "Raccoons," Eli muttered, not looking at me. "Under the foundation." I've heard raccoons. Raccoons scuttle. This sounded heavy. The thud was rhythmic, like a large animal pacing back and forth in a cage. Step, drag, thud. Step, drag, thud. Suddenly, the single bulb hanging from the ceiling flickered and died. The cabin plunged into darkness, illuminated only by the dying embers in the stove. "Generators out," Eli's voice came from the dark. I heard him stand up. The sounds from the basement got louder. Bang! Something slammed against the door from the inside. The wood groaned. It wasn't a raccoon.
It sounded like a man, or something the size of a man, throwing itself against the barrier. I sat up, my heart hammering against my ribs. Eli, that doesn't sound like a raccoon. I heard a match strike. A small flame flared up, illuminating Eli's face. He was standing much closer to me than I realized. He wasn't looking at the basement door anymore. He was looking at me. He was looking at my legs, then my arms, studying them with a cold, clinical curiosity. He blew out the match, plunging us back into darkness. "Tell me, Mark," he whispered, his voice trembling with a weird excitement. "Do you eat meat?"
The question hung in the air, absurd and terrifying. It didn't sound like he was offering me a steak. It sounded like he was asking if I was compatible. "What?" I stammered, backing away until my legs hit the couch. "Meat," Eli said again. I heard him moving toward the kitchen counter, the sound of metal sliding against metal, a drawer opening. "Red meat, muscle, it needs high protein. The winter has been long, the supply is low." "I don't understand," I said, reaching for my pocket where my knife usually was, only to remember it was in my bag, which was on the shelf behind Eli. "You don't need to understand," Eli said. "You just need to wait." He walked past me. He wasn't coming from me. He was walking toward the basement door. The banging from downstairs had changed. It was no longer random impacts. It was a frantic, rhythmic pounding, accompanied by a sound that made my blood freeze, a wet, gurgling wheeze, like a massive set of lungs trying to breathe through fluid. "Quiet down, Betsy," Eli cooed at the door. "Daddy's bringing a treat." I heard the first deadbolt slide back. Clack. Adrenaline hit my system like a lightning strike. He wasn't protecting me from the basement. He was opening the cage. "Eli, stop!" I yelled. He ignored me. Clack. The second deadbolt. I didn't wait for the third. I knew that whatever was behind that door was big, hungry, and angry. I lunged for the window next to the couch. It was old, single-pane glass. I grabbed a heavy brass lamp from the end table and swung it with everything I had. Crash! The glass shattered, and the freezing wind blasted into the room. "No!" Eli roared. The sound was animalistic. I heard the third deadbolt slide back just as I dove headfirst out the window. I landed in 4 feet of snow, the glass shards slicing my hands and face. I scrambled to my feet, gasping as the cold air burned my lungs. Behind me, inside the cabin, I heard the basement door creak open. Then, a sound that I will never forget. A wet, tearing noise and a heavy, thundering impact on the floorboards, followed by Eli screaming. It wasn't a scream of anger. It was a scream of command that quickly turned into a scream of pain. I didn't look back. I ran. I ran blindly into the black forest, wading through waist-deep snow, tripping over roots, fueled entirely by the terror of the noises echoing from the cabin. I heard wood splintering. I heard a roar that sounded like a bear mixed with a trash compactor. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours, but was probably only 10 minutes. I saw red and blue lights flashing against the snow-covered trees. I burst out onto the main road, waving my arms frantically. A Snohomish Sheriff's SUV was idling there, blocking the road for the plow trucks. I practically threw myself onto the hood. The deputy got out, gun drawn initially, until he saw the blood on my face and the sheer terror in my eyes. "He opened the door!" I was screaming, incoherent. "He let it out!" They put me in the back of the cruiser and called for backup. When I told them about the cabin and Eli, the deputy's face went grim. They knew the place. They knew Eli, but they had never had probable cause to go in. 4 units went up that logging road an hour later. I stayed at the station. Here is what the police report said. They found the cabin door torn off its hinges. The inside of the cabin was destroyed, furniture smashed to kindling, blood sprayed across the walls in arterial arcs. But it wasn't just Eli's blood. The basement door was wide open. When the officers went down there, they didn't find a monster. They found a prison.
There were 4 makeshift cells barred with rebar. In 3 of them, they found people, hikers and drifters who had gone missing over the last 6 months. They were emaciated, terrified, and freezing, but alive. But the 4th cell, the bars of the 4th cell had been bent outwards. Something with immense strength had forced its way out. They found Eli in the woods about 100 yards from the cabin, or they found pieces of Eli. He had been torn apart. The medical examiner said the jaw radius didn't match a bear, a cougar, or a wolf. The teeth were too flat, like human teeth, but 3 times the size. The survivors of the basement couldn't speak much about what they saw. They just said that Eli kept it in the last cell. He called it his daughter. He fed it raw meat. But during the storm, he had run out of food. They never found Betsy. The tracks led from Eli's body deeper into the Alpine Lakes wilderness, into terrains so rugged that no human could follow. The tracks looked like bare human feet, but they were 18 inches long. I still have nightmares about that question. Do you eat meat? I think Eli wasn't asking if I wanted dinner. He was checking the quality of the meal he was about to serve to the thing in the basement. And somewhere out there in the high Cascades, that thing is still hungry.
They say the worst thing about getting lost is the panic. I disagree. As an anthropologist who specializes in liminal spaces and urban legends, I can tell you the worst thing is when you find exactly what you were looking for, only to realize it doesn't follow the laws of physics. My partner, Sam, and I were chasing a rumor about a place called Holland. It wasn't a town you'd find on Google Maps or in any county records. It was what cartographers call a paper town, a fake settlement sometimes drawn on maps to catch copyright violators. But in the forums I frequent, people claimed Holland was real. They claimed it was a place that moved. We found the access road 3 hours west of the Appalachians, hidden behind a dense thicket of overgrown briars. It was exactly where the glitch coordinates said it would be. The town was small, barely a hamlet, a single cul-de-sac lined with 6 houses. 5 of them were leveled, nothing but foundations filled with rainwater and dead leaves. But the 6th house, at the very end of the loop, was standing. It was a 2-story Victorian, blackened by fire. The siding was charred alligator skin scales of wood, and the roof had collapsed on one side. It looked dead. It looked like it had been burning for 50 years. "Creepy," Sam muttered, adjusting the strap of his camera. "Lighting is perfect, though. Let's go." We walked up the driveway. The asphalt felt spongy under my boots like moss. When we reached the front door, I stopped. Carved into the charred wood of the door wasn't a number. It was a spiral. It had been gouged deep into the timber, exposing the raw, unburnt wood underneath. But the spiral was too perfect. No human hand could carve a curve that smooth, that mathematically precise into solid oak. It drew the eye in, making me feel slightly dizzy just looking at it. "Vandals?" Sam asked. "Maybe," I said, though I knew vandals used spray paint, not chisels. We pushed inside. The door swung open silently, which was the first red flag. A house that burnt usually has rusted hinges. Inside, the smell hit us. It didn't smell like smoke or mold. It smelled like static, like the air before a thunderstorm, mixed with the sterile scent of a hospital corridor. The interior didn't match the exterior. The walls weren't burnt. They were covered in peeling yellow floral wallpaper from the 1970s. The floorboards were dusty but intact. We moved through the living room, our footsteps echoing too loudly, and headed for the kitchen. That's when the timeline broke. Sitting on the rotting wooden counter was a thermos. It was a modern green Stanley thermos, the kind you buy at REI today, not in the 70s. Next to it was a baby's pacifier, bright blue plastic, looking brand new. "Someone's squatting here," Sam whispered, tensing up. I walked over to the thermos. I reached out and touched it. It was cold, but that wasn't the weird part. There was condensation on the outside. Beads of water were sweating down the metal. "Sam," I said, my voice trembling, "condensation evaporates, especially in a dry, drafty house like this.
This thermos was taken out of a fridge or filled with ice water less than 5 minutes ago. So they're close, Sam said, looking around for a weapon. No, I said, looking at the thick layer of dust on the floor. Look at the ground. The floor was covered in a gray carpet of dust that looked undisturbed for decades. There were our boot prints leading from the hallway to the counter, but there were no other footprints. None. The thermos and the pacifier were sitting there as if they had materialized out of thin air. We need to go. The academic curiosity was gone, replaced by a primal lizard brain instinct that screamed danger. We turned back toward the hallway to leave. We walked past the living room and reached the staircase that led to the second floor, which was right next to the front door. I stopped dead in my tracks. Sam bumped into me. "What?" he asked. "Where is the door?" I whispered. We were standing in the hallway. To our left should have been the front door we just walked through 2 minutes ago. It was gone. There was no door. There was no frame. There was just a solid wall of yellow floral wallpaper, seamless and unbroken. That's impossible," Sam laughed, a nervous, high-pitched sound. "Maybe it's the back door." We didn't turn around, Sam. We walked in a straight line. We ran to the living room window. Through the grime, we could see the burnt siding of the house's exterior, but when Sam tried to unlatch the window, the lock wouldn't budge. "Stand back," Sam said. He grabbed a heavy iron fireplace poker from the hearth. "I'm smashing it." He swung with all his strength. Thud! The poker bounced off the glass as if he had hit a wall of solid rubber. The glass didn't crack. It didn't even vibrate. It absorbed the impact. "What is this?" Sam yelled, swinging again. Thud! "Stop!" I grabbed his arm. The room suddenly felt smaller. "Listen." The silence of the house was gone. It had been replaced by a sound coming from everywhere at once. It was a low, rhythmic whoosh. Pause. Whoosh. It was coming from under the floorboards. It sounded wet. It sounded like lungs.
The house was breathing. I don't mean the wind was blowing through the eaves. I mean the architecture itself was expanding and contracting. The floral wallpaper rippled slightly with every exhalation. The floorboards beneath our feet felt soft, giving way like cartilage rather than wood. "We are not in a house," I said, backing away from the walls. "We are inside something that looks like a house." Sam was hyperventilating. "The stairs! Let's try the second floor. Maybe there's a window that works." We scrambled up the staircase. As we climbed, I noticed the steps were changing. The wood grain was swirling, shifting into shapes that looked like veins. By the time we reached the landing, the stairs behind us had smoothed over. I looked back. The staircase was gone. It had fused into a smooth, steep ramp of drywall. We were trapped on the second floor. We ran into the master bedroom. It was empty, save for a single chair in the center of the room facing the wall. On the wall, carved into the plaster, was that same spiral. It was pulsing now, beating in time with the wet breathing sound that filled the air. Whoosh! Hush! "The window!" Sam shouted. He ran to the bedroom window and looked out. "I can see the car! It's right there!" He slammed the butt of the camera against the glass. Nothing. It was harder than concrete. "It's digesting us," I said. The realization hit me with icy clarity. The fresh thermos, the pacifier, they weren't evidence of squatters. They were lures. Or maybe they were undigested bits of previous victims, regurgitated to make the set look convincing. The walls were closing in, literally. The room was 5 feet narrower than it had been a minute ago. The doorframe we had entered through began to shrink, the wood warping and sealing shut like a healing wound. "We have to get out," Sam screamed. "Think, you study this stuff. How do you get out of a liminal trap?" "You don't break out," I said, my mind racing through folklore and quantum theory. "You have to find the glitch, the seam. Nothing mimics reality perfectly. There has to be a mistake." I scanned the room frantically. The breathing was louder now, a wet gurgle right behind the paint. The floor was warm to the touch. Then I saw it. In the corner of the room was a closet door, but the shadow cast by the door handle was wrong. The light was coming from the window on the left, but the shadow fell toward the light. "The closet," I yelled. We threw the door open. Inside, there were no clothes. There was no back wall. There was a dark, narrow tunnel that shouldn't have fit within the geometry of the house. It smelled of ozone and raw meat.
Go, I pushed Sam. It's too small. It's a throat, Sam. Crawl. We squeezed into the darkness. The space was tight, pressing against our shoulders. The walls here weren't wood or plaster. They felt like warm, slick, wet velvet. We crawled on our bellies, the air hot and suffocating. Behind us, I heard the bedroom crunching, the sound of wood splintering and glass shattering as the room collapsed into itself. I felt something brush against my ankle. A tongue? A cilia? I kicked blindly and scrambled forward. Ahead, I saw a square of light, a vent cover. "Kick it!" I screamed. Sam kicked the grate, once, twice. It gave way with a metallic clang. We fell. We tumbled out onto wet grass, coughing and gasping for air. We scrambled to our feet and ran until our lungs burned, not stopping until we reached the gravel of the cul-de-sac. We collapsed by the car, looking back at the house. It stood there, silent. The burnt siding was still. The roof was collapsed. It looked exactly as it had when we arrived. Dead, cold. "We made it," Sam wheezed, checking his camera. "We were in there for, 20 minutes? An hour?" I looked at the sky. When we entered the house, it was 2 p.m. The sun was high and bright. Now, the sky was a pale, washed-out gray. The sun was coming up over the eastern horizon. I looked at my watch. It had stopped. I looked at my phone. The battery was dead, but Sam's was still on. He checked the time and dropped the phone on the gravel. "Mark," he whispered, "it's tomorrow." We had been inside for 40 minutes, but out here, 18 hours had passed. We got in the car and drove. We didn't speak for the first 100 miles. But as we stopped for gas in the next state over, I noticed something that made me vomit in the trash can. On the back of Sam's jacket, in the thick dust he had picked up through crawling through that tunnel, a pattern had been pressed into the fabric. It was a perfect spiral. And inside the car, sitting in the cup holder where I had left my water bottle, there was a blue plastic pacifier. We never went back. And if you ever see a road on a map that looks like it shouldn't be there, if the GPS tells you to turn onto a street called Holland, turn around. The house is hungry, and I don't think it likes that we got away.